How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to In with Denoux featuring Jordan and Gio. I'm back here with you for a solo episode. I promise you at some point we'll get back to a normal recording schedule where we have more than just me. But like I did tell you last week, we have some guests coming up that I'm really excited about. I just wanted to let you know also that Jordan and his wife Emily are doing well. Baby Avery is healthy and doing well. But I just want Jordan to be able to take as much time away as he needs to take care of his family and take care of their new baby daughter, and obviously John as well, their son. So be praying for Jordan, be praying for his family, and we hope to get him back here at some point, but I want him to definitely take all the time that he needs. But Jordan, we love you. We're thinking about you. And obviously, I have been communicating with you. But those of our listeners that are wondering, that's where Jordan is at, and he is doing well. And so pray for him. And if you know him, reach out, see how they're doing, and send some encouragement their way. So today, we're going to do something very fun, very cool. It is Monday, the day after Mother's Day. So all the mothers listening, happy Mother's Day. We love you. We appreciate you. And so I thought we would do a special episode dedicated to mothers of the Bible. And so we have 7 or 8 mothers that we're going to walk through, talk quickly. They're going to kind of be rapid fire, a couple minutes for each mother, and just kind of talk about their impact, talk about their legacy, what we can learn from their circumstances in their lives. And after each a little section here for each mother, I'll have 2 questions that are kind of like a practical question that you can think about, and also a reflection question that maybe brings some deeper thought for you as well. So as always, thank you guys for supporting us, for joining the channel. Please like, share, comment, subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment below. That will help us grow. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave us a rating and a review. And also, if you are listening, go ahead and jump over to YouTube, hit subscribe there. That will help us out. And if you really are dedicated, hit that bell so you get notified every time we post a new video, whether it's a long form content like this or a short. We're really trying to grow our YouTube, which would be a huge help to us. So if you're a listener every week, make sure that you're following on all the platforms just to help us out. Even if you only listen or watch on one of those, that will be super helpful for us. So without further ado, let's jump into the episode today. So we're going to these are kind of going in order of the scriptures as well as you read through the Bible. So our first mother is, of course, Eve, the very first mother in scripture. And honestly, Eve gets kind of a bad rap, right? Like, she gets blamed for everything that happens there after the fall. And so when people talk about Eve, they usually focus on just that, the fall. They focus on the mistake that she made, the fruit that she ate that she was not supposed to. And then Adam therefore eats as well. The serpent tricking her, that is kind of her legacy in a lot of people's eyes. But the fascinating thing about her story is after humanity falls, Eve becomes the first person in history to carry hope through motherhood as well, right? And I want you to imagine this, because I think sometimes even those of us who believe in the scriptures and know that it's real, we still sometimes read the Bible as these fairy tales or things that kind of like a movie where we look at it and it's easy for us to sit there and say, oh, like, why would she do this? Why would this person in this movie do that? I would have done it this way, but not put ourselves in the shoes of that person, right? Because in all honesty, what Eve did, we do every day. It's just not recorded in a book that's going to be read for generations and generations and generations to come, right? Like, we very well may have done the exact same thing that Eve did, and most likely would have. Right. And so I want you to keep that in mind as we talk through Eve's story a little bit, just to put yourself in her shoes, because sometimes I think because Eve makes that mistake, we dehumanize her and the rest of her story becomes less powerful. But I want you just to forget about Eve's mistake. Just think about a woman and a mother, a daughter of God, and think about how her life must have been thereafter, because it's very heavy. And I think lots of times we don't catch that because of the mistake that Eve made earlier in the scriptures. So I just want you to imagine this. Eve watches paradise collapse. And again, now we know that a lot of it is of her own doing, but just stick with me here and try to put yourself in her shoes. She watches paradise collapse. She experiences shame for the first time. And many of us know, including myself, what shame can do to your nervous system, to your thinking, to your distortion of God lots of times. She experiences shame for the first time. She doesn't necessarily, like, she has God obviously, but she doesn't have a therapist or something that we may have to work through all these emotions. She's the first person that experiences shame. She sees death enter the world, right? But then she becomes a mother. And again, stick with me. Her first son, Cain, murders her second son, Abel, right? Can you imagine this pain? She already has this shame that is on her, and now she experiences death for the first time, and it's her son, one of her sons killing another one of her sons. She's the first mother that experiences a funeral of her child, or a funeral period, right? And yet scripture calls her the mother of all living, right? Because Eve's story reminds us that motherhood often exists in tension. There's joy, but there's also grief. There's hope, but there's also heartbreak. And there's life, but there's also loss, right? We all experience joy and grief, but a mother who gives birth to their child, whether they lose that child in childbirth, whether that child dies before their time, you have this hope of what you think your child might be, and maybe they don't live up to those expectations, or they bring a lot of disappointment. And I think that we learn here that Eve experiences all of that, right? She has these sons. One of her sons kills the other son, which I'm sure, she had these dreams and these hopes for her sons. And then this happens, right? There's life and there's loss. Some mothers listening to this, and if they're listening on the day it came out or in the future, exactly what that tension feels like, right? And yet, even after the failure that Eve experiences, God still works through Eve, right? And that will be a word of encouragement for somebody, right? Your mistakes do not disqualify your legacy and what you and your family can become. So a few questions for Eve, right? What is one mistake, regret, or painful moment in your life that you need to stop allowing to define your future? And the second question is, how can God still bring life, purpose, and legacy out of broken places in your story? So as always, with these questions, you could jot them down and look at them later. You can pause and think about them now, or if you just want to listen through the whole episode and maybe come back to them. But I hope that these questions after each little section here really help bring some thought-provoking things about your own life that these women experienced through motherhood. Okay, so that is Eve, the first mother. Next, we have Sarah, the mother who waited. So we meet Sarah after Eve, and Sarah's story is deeply emotional, right? Because it's a story of patience and waiting, and I know that's hard for all of us, but God promises her and Abraham a son, as we know. But year after year, time passes and nothing happens, right? There's no pregnancy, there's no miracle, and seemingly no answer for Sarah and Abraham. And in biblical culture, for those of you who don't know, is that infertility carried enormous shame, right? Because so much of this time period is about populating the earth, building a family line and legacy. And so if you could not have a child, and especially a son who could carry on the line, there was deep shame that came with that, right? And so Sarah reaches a point where disappointment reshapes how she thinks and the decisions that she makes. And she tries to, quote unquote, help God out, as we do oftentimes. We get impatient with God's timing and we try to force something that doesn't need to be forced. And so Sarah tries to force the issue through Hagar. And Hagar is someone we'll get to next. And that is very, as I just said, is relatable, right? We try to force things so much because the waiting feels unbearable at times, depending on what we're waiting for in life. But then after that, at 90 years old, God fulfills his promise to Sarah and Abraham. The Bible says that Sarah laughed when she heard this, right? That she was going to become a mother, a biological mother at 90 years old. And she wasn't laughing because it was funny. She was laughing because it seemed impossible. Like she didn't believe that this was actually going to happen. And I think that that's the message of Sarah's story, right? Is that God is still working in seasons that look barren in our life, right? Some people listening might feel like, their prayers that they're praying day after day are barren. Their dreams that they've had that seemingly have passed them by, can relate to this, are barren. Their calling is barren. This is what I think I'm called for, but it doesn't seem to work out. What is God trying to tell me? Or maybe their family is barren, like Sarah thought for year after year. Maybe you are, a couple that wants to have children and is having trouble conceiving, and you feel like that aspect of your life is barren, but God specializes in impossible timing, right? And maybe it doesn't come the way you think. Maybe you adopt a child, maybe you foster a child, or whatever it may be. And that's just for that specific thought of having a child. But with all these things, with prayers that are barren, with dreams that are barren, God specializes in the impossible, in bringing things into your life in ways that you didn't expect, in ways that you wouldn't have thought it would look like, but God specializes in impossible timing. So Sarah's story teaches us that delay doesn't mean that you are being denied by God. So the questions I have for this section is, what promise, prayer, or dream are you tempted to force because waiting has become frustrating for you? And the second question is, what would trusting God's timing actually look like in your current season of life? So that is Sarah. So next we come to Hagar, the single mother that God saw, right? So Hagar was used, quite honestly. She was rejected and she was abandoned, right? She becomes pregnant through Abraham, and conflict erupts after this, right? Eventually, she's sent away into the wilderness with her son Ishmael, and she's a single mother in the desert with no resources, no way of really providing for their life. And this is one of the most beautiful moments in much of the Old Testament, in my opinion, is that God meets her there in the wilderness, right? And in fact, Hagar is the first person in the Bible to give God a name, and it's El Roy or El Rio, El Roy, something like that, but it translates to the God who sees me, which is just such a beautiful moment. And because some mothers oftentimes can feel invisible in our culture with the way that they're treated, the way that they're overlooked, and they give everything, right? If you're a single mother, I'm sure you can relate to this, that you give everything emotionally, spiritually, financially, physically, to your children, and still feel unseen in many ways. And I think it's one of the many reasons why we need to honor, especially in the church, single mothers, lift them up, make them feel seen, loved, heard. But Hagar's story says that God sees you, mothers that are exhausted, that feel abandoned. If you're a single mother, if you're overwhelmed, God sees you and he will meet you where you're at. And the wilderness is not evident of God's absence, as we learn from Hagar. Sometimes the wilderness where you sometimes can feel abandoned is right where God will introduce himself to you. So be looking for him if you feel like you're in the wilderness wandering as a mother or maybe a single mother, that God will meet you where you're at. So the questions for Hagar: who in your life may feel unseen, overlooked, or abandoned that you can intentionally encourage this week, and maybe just moving forward, maybe not just this week, but just moving forward in general. The second question is, have there been moments where God met you most deeply in seasons of loneliness or wilderness? And maybe you're experiencing one of those now, and you can look back on a time where God pulled you from that, or maybe ask around for some people, when is a time when you felt lonely, you felt abandoned, you felt overlooked, where God has pulled you out of that season. And that can really help build community. When you talk to people about pain and loss and suffering, grief, lots of times that can build a community through learning about your life and about God through those moments. Okay, next we have Jochebed. I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that right. The mother who let go. Now, Jochebed is the mother of Moses, of course. And imagine having a child, giving birth to a child, especially a son, during this time, during a genocide, right? Pharaoh orders that all the Hebrew baby boys be killed, be thrown into the Nile and killed. And Jochebed hides Moses for 3 months, but eventually she can't hide a baby any longer. So as we all know the famous story, she places him in a basket on the Nile River, which in of itself is crazy and dangerous, but she's so desperate that this is what she has to do. So just imagine her releasing her child, or imagine yourself releasing your child into uncertainty, right? Because it's the only chance they have to survive. And that is one of the most faithful moments in the scriptures. And real motherhood often involves letting go. Parenting a child oftentimes involves letting go, letting your children grow, letting them fail, letting them become who God called them to be. And sometimes that goes well, and sometimes that doesn't do so well. But it's incredible that the very river, right, that she releases Moses into became the pathway for his destiny. To be raised by the Egyptians, know their culture, know the king, know Pharaoh, know his family, become a part of that family, but then realize that his real people were the ones that were enslaved to his pseudo family. And he then frees the Israelites from the Egyptians, that very river that was meant for death, right? The children were being thrown into the Nile, the sons were being thrown into the Nile, and that very river that was meant for death drifted him to his destiny of leading God's people, through the Red Sea and out of captivity. So some mothers listening are struggling to release control. And listen, I understand I am a man, talking about these things, and it's easier said than done. Easy for me to sit here and say these things, but if you're a mother, sometimes it's hard to release control, right? But Jochebed teaches us that children ultimately belong to God, right? Our children, our sons and daughters, don't belong specifically to us, but to God. And sometimes the hardest acts of love requires surrender, right? And I know that this one is, like I said, easier said than done, but having worked with teenagers much of my adult life, I remember even in Zoe Church where I'm going now, a mother asking me about, how to help a child but not be overbearing, and help them want to push them towards God, but making sure you're not forcing them to God. And it was just such a fascinating conversation to see and hear the love that this woman had for her child. And honestly, just to have the humility to ask someone who's not a parent, but has worked with teenagers, helping them find God, and try to help her as best I could understand of, that child has to sometimes make mistakes, and they're either going to learn from their mistakes or they're going to dive deeper into those mistakes, and you can help guide them, but ultimately they have to choose God. They have to choose to love God. And I can't imagine, not being a parent and having to kind of surrender that control to God, like we see here of her just placing Moses in the river and trusting that God is going to protect that child. So anyways, just a quick story there. But the two questions for this section here is, what area of control are you struggling to surrender to God right now? And the second question is, why is letting go often one of the hardest but most necessary acts of faith? Okay, so next we have Hannah, the mother who prayed. So Hannah's pain was a deep, deep pain, right? She desperately wanted a child and endured constant humiliation because she couldn't conceive, kind of like we talked about earlier with Sarah, how oftentimes if you couldn't conceive, it was looked down upon in society because so much was about building your family line, like we talked about earlier. But Hannah did something that was remarkable, right? She brought her pain honestly before God, right? And there's a scene where she is praying so intensely that Eli, the priest, thinks she is drunk, right? That's how brokenhearted she was before God. And God answers her prayer eventually with a son named Samuel. And 1st and 2nd Samuel are two of my favorite books in the Bible. So I'm grateful for Hannah and her persistence in prayer. But here's the shocking part, right? Is that after all of this pain, after all of this, these prayers where she's willing to humiliate herself, right? Where the priest thinks she's drunk. After all that, she's given a son, right? And after receiving that miracle in Samuel, Hannah gives him back to God. Go read about it. We don't really have time to dive deep into it here, maybe on another episode, and we can dive deeper into this story. But she gives Samuel back to God, and that is radical trust. And Hannah's story teaches us something that is really big, and that's that great mothers don't just raise children for themselves. It's a little bit about what we talked about before. They raise children for God's purpose. Her prayer shaped a prophet that would shape a nation, and him becoming a prophet is a lot of what that entails, of her giving him back to God, which again we can't go into right now, but that story is incredible. And so never underestimate a praying mom. Some of the strongest people that are walking the earth are standing on the prayers of moms and grandmoms and things of that nature. So a great story that I would highly encourage you to go and dive deeper into. And the two questions here are, what burden or desire do you need to bring honestly before God instead of carrying that silently? And the second question is, how might constant prayer shape not only your life, but future lives, whether it's in your own family line or just other generations that would come after us? All right, the next section here we have, Ruth and Naomi. Now, a while back, Jordan and I did a episode, I think just one episode, might have been two, I think just one episode though, on Ruth and Naomi, and it was a part of the a little bit ongoing series, which we'll come back to at some point, of the mighty men and women of God. So I would definitely encourage you after this episode, if you want to hear more about that, you can go back and find that. It was from, I don't know, 3 or 4 months ago. So you can go back and find, I'm pretty sure the title of the episode is Mighty Men and Women of God, Ruth, or whatever. So Ruth and Naomi, and this section is entitled Motherhood Beyond Biology. So because motherhood isn't always biological, and I want to tell you a little bit about this story, because Naomi loses her husband, right? And then loses her sons. And she's obviously heartbroken and devastated. And Ruth is her daughter-in-law. So obviously Ruth's husband has died, which is one of Naomi's sons. So Ruth chooses not to leave Naomi, right? And she famously has the line that says, where you go, I will go, your people will be my people, your God will be my God, which is just super incredible. All of these stories I think you should go back and look into, but this is another one that's just so great. I love this story. And so Ruth, through loyalty, through sacrifice, through faithfulness, she becomes a part of the lineage of Jesus. Ruth does. The story reminds us that spiritual motherhood matters. Mentorship matters. Some women never give birth biologically, but they have mothered other people spiritually, emotionally, relationally. I know that this was so huge for me. Like, obviously, I have a great mother and a great relationship with my mom, who did a great job. But when I went off to college and was on my own for the first time. And, once I started getting my life back on track spiritually and going back to church, there were so many women in the church as a young man that I learned from, and there's a lot of great men and fathers and stuff, obviously, that I learned from as well. But so many women that I feel became moms away from home, right? Like, that made sure I was fed, made sure that I had somewhere to go. Like, if I couldn't go home for Thanksgiving, like, I always had families that made sure that I was taken care of. And I kind of became a part of so many people's families through those years in college. So even if you don't give birth biologically, you can still be a mother to a college student, to a child who doesn't have a mom. Maybe their mom passed away or whatever. You can still be a mother, because motherhood is definitely bigger than DNA. So Ruth and Naomi, I know these are quick, but again, I encourage you to go back and look at these stories more in depth. But the questions I have for this section is, who has spiritually, emotionally, or relationally mothered you in your life, and how can you honor them? And the second question is, how can you become a source of encouragement or wisdom or nurturing for someone else, maybe that isn't necessarily your biological child? Okay, 2 more segments here. The next section is Bathsheba, and this one is entitled Redemption from Broken Stories. We also want to bring light to and acknowledge that not every biblical story, not every biblical mother is a clean, inspirational story, right? Because Bathsheba enters the scriptures through scandal and through tragedy involving David. Her story begins with exploitation, grief, and loss, but God brings redemption through her story. Eventually, she becomes the mother of Solomon, very prominent king. And this matters because some people feel disqualified by painful chapters in their life, by messy chapters in their lives. But throughout scripture, God continually brings redemption out of brokenness. We see this over and over and over again. And what it teaches us is that your worst chapter does not have final authority over your future life and legacy that you leave. And I think that, man, I can relate to this one so much. And I was kind of going back and forth about sharing this story, but for the sake of the point of so much of this, and I'm obviously gonna, not put names to this story outside of myself, but as many of you know through either just knowing me personally or listening to the pod, even I've talked vaguely about my upbringing and going through things as a teenager and putting myself in situations where, I just wasn't honoring God with my choices and whatnot. As many of us do as teenagers, whether it's public and known like my stuff was, or whether it's secret and no one ever knew or found out. All right. But what I was going through as a teenager became very public through reasons I won't talk about now, but it became very public of what was going on. And I struggled with impure relationship. And when I say that, I feel like people jump like so far down the path. And I promise you, it probably wasn't as crazy as what you imagine in your mind, although it wasn't good. There was some very bad aspects to it. And it became very public in the church. And the reason I bring up this story of this last little bit that I talked about here is that, God brings redemption out of brokenness. Your worst chapter doesn't have authority over your future. But I think some people, and when I say this, whether it's not intended for bad or people not realizing what they're doing, I don't want to I don't want to throw stones at people that maybe didn't react well to my situation, but there are some people in my life, and it's only a few, and I'm thinking of one specific situation, but that happened when I was 14, 15 years old. I'm 36 years old now. So over 20 years ago, and a couple years ago, I was in another place, not where I grew up or whatever, but there was someone in the church that was a part of the church I was a part of growing up that happened to live in this other place now. And so I was visiting there and I was able to do a communion, message for the church there. And this person and me and my family were on vacation or whatever. So my parents were there, my sister was there. And, this woman was talking to my mom after the service and, she was telling my mom like, oh, Chase did so well with the communion, blah, 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 blah. But then she ended it with this phrase that bothers me to this day, that she was basically like commending my communion and then threw in this line of, and that's really great considering his past. And she's referring to me as a teenager when I was 15 years old. And I'm at this point, at that point I was probably, I don't know, 30, something like that. And it just shows it. Honestly, when I say that, I was bitter about that for a little bit when I first heard, my mom told me about that. But really all it did now, like now that I think about it now, is that it shows how much God's love is so different than human love and so much better than human love, that God doesn't hold me to that mistake that I made when I was a teenager. And if anything, that says more about that person than it does me, to be honest, if they still want to bring it up 20 years later. And like I said, I'm not condemning that person necessarily, but I'm just saying I think it says more about if someone wants to hold you to a mistake, even a year or 6 months after you did it, if you've repented of it, then that says more about their character than it does about the mistake that you made. And so if that's you, if you're someone that feels tied to a mistake that you made, whether it was a week ago or 20 years ago, in like my case here, is that if you have faced that bad choice that you made and you had the conversations that you needed to have, and you rectified that situation between the people that were involved, but also with God, that you don't need to feel guilty anymore about that. You made a mistake like everyone has, and you do not need to be tied to that mistake. And I know some people are listening, they're like, Chase, you don't need to say that, that's obvious. But there are a lot of people like myself that are really guilty souls and guilty consciences and hold themselves hostage to a situation that they were a part of years ago, oftentimes. And so I just want to let you know, if that's you sitting here, that shame off of you, right? Like that's something that Miss Laura at church says, Brandon's wife, is shame off of you, right? Like don't let the shame of that moment hold you in shame for, a long period of time if you've worked it out through you and God. So sorry, that was a little bit of a rant. Okay, our last mom here, of course, Mary, the mother of Jesus, possibly the most influential mother in human history, right? Mary in her story was young. She was unexpectedly pregnant, to say the least. She was misunderstood through that time. She was judged. And yet, when an angel appeared, her response was similar to Jesus in the garden, right? Like basically, let this be according to your word, right? Like, let this be unto me according to your word, right? And it's such a surrendering response. Mary carried Jesus physically, before he came into the world and led us all spiritually. She physically carried Jesus and fed him, taught him, watched him grow like any other mother would, and eventually had to watch him suffer in the heaviest way possible in all of human history. One of the most heartbreaking images in the scriptures is Mary, standing near the cross, the mother who held him as a baby, now watching him die the most brutal death in human history. She watches this son who she raised, that we see as Lord and God, but she also sees him as that, but also her son. She's, carrying what others didn't understand. She's enduring pain quietly, trusting God when her future was unclear, especially during the pregnancy of Jesus. And honestly, Mary's life kind of destroys this myth that being chosen by God means that your life will be easy, right? She's the mother of the Son of God, and her life still has suffering. Being chosen by God doesn't eliminate suffering, but it does mean that God is with you through that suffering. Okay, so the two questions for this section here is, what difficult assignment or season is God asking you to trust him through right now? And the second question is, how can surrender to God coexist with uncertainty, suffering, or fear? Okay, so when you step back and you look at all of these women, all of these mothers together, it's really incredible what you see happening through this weaving story of God, right? Of God's love, of God's promise, of God's plan for salvation, is that, none of them were perfect. And that's the case with so many figures in the scriptures, right? Eve struggled and in many ways caused the downfall of humanity. Sarah doubted. Hagar was rejected. Naomi became bitter. Bathsheba withstood scandal in her life, and Mary endured sorrow. And yet God worked powerfully through all of them and pushed his story forward, pushed redemption forward. And that's the beauty of the scriptures, right? Is that God uses imperfect people, imperfect stories to accomplish eternal purposes. Motherhood doesn't mean perfection. It's sacrifice, it's faithfulness, as we've seen through these women. It's nourishing life when life feels difficult. And honestly, many mothers never realize the full impact that they're having, right? A quiet prayer, a difficult sacrifice, a bedtime conversation as they comfort their child, a moment of encouragement. These things echo through our lives as children. If we think back to the impact that our mothers or women that played a motherly role in our lives had on us, they echo through our lives and into future generations. Some of the greatest movements in history began because someone had a mother that was praying for them. So as we close here, I want to leave you with two last questions here. So who are the women in your life whose sacrifices, prayers, and faithfulness help shape who you are today? Remember those women, pray for those women, encourage those women. And lastly, what kind of legacy are you building through the way you love, lead, encourage, and serve others? So today, or yesterday, we're listening on Monday, we honor mothers, but we really honor mothers every day, right? Biological mothers, spiritual mothers, single mothers, adoptive mothers, grandmothers, women who are longing to be mothers, women grieving motherhood, and women who stepped in when no one else would. We thank you. We love you. And if you're listening today and your relationship with your mother is complicated or difficult, we acknowledge that as well. And we know that Mother's Day is a joy for most, but painful for many as well. But the beautiful thing about the gospel and the story that God has given us is that he steps into those broken places with healing and with redemption. And I hope that this episode of talking about these women and these mothers of the Bible really encourages you. If you're thinking of someone like, man, this would be encouraging to this person because of circumstances they're in, make sure to share it with them and hopefully it encourages them as well. But as always, I love you guys. Thank you for listening. Please like, comment, share, subscribe. We'll see you next week. And as Jordan always says, I'm out.